Let's take a look at this override function touches began. This override function is something that is custom with SpriteKit, and it's something that's within the backend. And what this does is that this says when you touch anywhere on the screen, it will call this code. Now, this highlighted area, the for touch and touches, will say for every time that you touch, it will set a location. Now, let's set the location up top here. Okay, because again, by setting the variable up above the class, you can use that variable throughout the entire project. We'll say this is touch location and make that equal to a CG point. Okay, question mark and brackets here, and that will allow us to just make it a CG point. Now, instead of this for touch and touches, we're going to say touch location is equal to touch location and node and self. All this is saying here is that we are going to store wherever we touch the location here. Now what's cool about this is that we can, for example, set the player dot position dot x to the touch location dot x. And we can set the player dot position dot y is equal to the touch location dot y. So what this does is that this will now set our touch location to x and y. Now, what is technically being asked here, and what's interesting about Swift is that Swift is constantly evolving. So what I typed out there worked maybe 6 months ago, but in order to make it work now, you need to add in the question mark and the exclamation point. What this does is that the touch location is optional, and the exclamation point will unwrap that data. So let's go ahead and let's run it here. And let's go into the simulator here. And every time I touch, you can see that I'm just moving around. Pretty cool stuff. That's all it is. Now what we can also do is, if we really wanted to, we could spawn another sprite here. And how would we do that? Well, first of all, we would say spawn sprite, and we would spawn the sprite whenever we touch. And instead of this position here of being a CG point, we'll literally just cut this code and paste it in here. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is, let's run it right now, because I just want to show you what's going to happen. Okay. So it's asking for a touch location, and an error. Why did it add to be an error here? When you add in the question mark here, it technically adds in a nil. So right now touch location is equal to nil, and when you set the player position to a nil, it crashes the program. So all you have to do is you have to get rid of that spawn sprite. So that's a very common mistake you get. And notice what came up here. We had this sidebar here, and you can also see that we added this in here. So let's stop it and run it again. And I'm just going to close all that item here. And now you can see every time I touch, it does work. So look at that. We're spawning all these sprites here. And at the bottom, you'll see that, we got, every time we added more, it just adds in more nodes. And the more nodes you add in, you'll see that the FPS will drop. So the more nodes you add, the more laggy it can get. All right, so that's something that you want to keep in mind. All right, that looks pretty good. So we can now add in, for example, a spawn sprite here. Okay. Now what happens if you want to, let's say, add in a function or an override function, touches ended? What do you think this does? Well, it does exactly what it's supposed to do, and I'm just going to copy and paste the for touches code in there. And I'm going to delete the spawn sprite in the touches began. So let's go ahead and let's run it here, and it's going to do that here. So you click, right? You can click, and then whenever you release, it will spawn the sprite here. Okay. So we got touches began, touches ended, and lastly here we're going to have touches override function touches moved. Okay. Now, I'm just going to get rid of the spawn sprite. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the position back here. So player dot position is equal to CG point. And we're going to make it a CG rect get mid X. And that's going to be self.frame. And then we're going to make this CG rect get mid, in this case, Y, but we'll change that in a second. So get mid Y. And we're going to make it self.frame. Make sure you close off your brackets. And what we'll do is we will spawn the sprite on the start here. So what touches moved is going to do is we're going to copy this 4touches code, and we're going to say player dot position dot x is equal to bracket touch location dot x exclamation point, and then player dot position dot y is equal to touch location dot y, and there you go. So let's take a look at that here. Now touches moved will be if you want to, let's say, hold and drag. So we'll run that here. And this is actually something that's really interesting. The simulator has crashed, so all you have to do is quit. And whenever you get this kind of error, all it means is that the simulator has crashed. Save it if you haven't already done so, and let's run that again. What this is going to do now is we'll take a look at this here, and look at that. I'm moving it around. Okay, there we go, and that actually looks pretty good. I think that actually looks great. So lastly, if you want to, let's say, add in kind of like a space shooter, let's put this down towards the bottom. So let's go to our CG rect frame, and let's subtract 350. So actually, this has to be in the Y here. So remember, the Y, it's putting it in the middle, and then we're going to subtract 350 for it. Okay, and it's asking you here. And the reason why there's an error is because there wasn't a space. Swift is very picky about its spaces. And if I go and I comment out, and what this comment does, if you add in those 2 slashes, it will not read that code. So you can type in little notes to yourself. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and say that this line here is no longer being read. And if we look at this here and we run it here, we'll only move it on the X coordinate. Remember, and X is across here. So if you're making a simple space shooter, this is actually pretty handy, right? And likewise, if you were making a horizontal side scroller, you could only set the Y if you really wanted to. So that's how you add in the touches moved, touches ended, and touches began. All right, this includes the tutorial.